It was the 9th of August in the year 378. By the time the sun set that evening, 2/3 of the entire Eastern Roman field army would be dead, and an emperor of Rome, a ruling Augustus, the first in the empire's 400-year history to die in battle against a foreign enemy, would vanish from history entirely, his body never recovered, his tomb forever empty. Historians would later call this single afternoon near the town of Adrianople the day the fall of Rome truly began. To understand how an emperor ended up dead in a wheat field in Thrace, you have to go back several years earlier to a crisis unfolding far beyond Rome's borders. A new and terrifying power had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns, a nomadic people whose mounted archers moved faster and struck harder than anything the tribes of Europe had ever faced. They fought without warning and without mercy, appearing on the horizon in numbers no one could accurately predict, and vanishing just as quickly, leaving entire kingdoms in ashes behind them. Rumors of their cruelty traveled faster than their armies did, and by the time the Huns actually arrived at a Gothic settlement, panic had often already done half their work for them. As the Huns swept westward across the plains, they shattered the Gothic kingdoms in their path one after another. Kings who had ruled for generations reduced to refugees within a single season. Thousands upon thousands of Gothic refugees, entire tribes with nowhere left to run, arrived at the banks of the Danube River, the very edge of the Roman Empire, and begged to be let in. The Roman Emperor of the East, Valens, saw an opportunity in their desperation. He needed soldiers for his wars against Persia, and here were tens of thousands of able-bodied men arriving at his doorstep, willing to fight for the empire in exchange for land and safety. In the late summer of 376, Valens agreed to let the Gothic tribes led by Fritigern and Alavivus cross the Danube, under one condition. They would surrender their weapons at the border. The scale of the crossing itself was almost unimaginable. Roman officials, overwhelmed and understaffed, tried to ferry what ancient sources describe as somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people across a single river. Working through nights by torchlight, boats overloaded and sometimes capsizing in the current, families separated in the crush of bodies, desperate to reach the far bank before Hunnic riders could catch them from behind. It was here that Rome's greed took over. The local commanders responsible for processing the crossing, a man named Lupicinus and his colleague Maximus, saw an even greater opportunity than their emperor did. Rather than honestly overseeing the resettlement, they turned the crisis into a personal fortune. Weapons inspections were bribed away, allowing armed warriors to slip across disguised as unarmed refugees. Promised food rations never arrived in the quantities agreed upon. And when starvation set in among the Gothic camps, Roman officials began selling dog meat to desperate families at an unthinkable price. One dog for one child, sold into slavery. By the winter of 377, the Goths were no longer grateful refugees. They were a starving, humiliated, and increasingly armed population living inside the very empire that had promised to protect them. Lupicinus, sensing the danger too late, tried to solve the problem the way Rome so often did, through betrayal rather than reform. He invited the Gothic leaders Fritigern and Alavivus to a lavish banquet under the guise of renewed friendship and cooperation, intending to have them quietly assassinated the moment the wine had done its work, while their followers celebrated outside, leaderless and unsuspecting once their chieftains failed to return home. Roman soldiers positioned discreetly around the banquet hall waited for the signal. Alavivus never left that hall alive. Fritigern, through skill or sheer fortune, drew his sword the instant he sensed the trap closing, cut his way to the door and escaped into the night, rallying his people just outside the walls before Lupicinus's soldiers could finish what they had started. The Goths did not scatter in fear at the news. They rose in fury. What followed was nearly 2 years of brutal, inconclusive warfare across the Balkans. Gothic warbands, joined by escaped slaves, deserting Roman soldiers, and even Hunnic and Allan mercenaries drawn by the chaos, raided and burned their way across Roman Thrace, while Roman generals struggled again and again to bring them into a single decisive battle that might end the crisis outright. At a place called Ad Salices, Roman and Gothic forces finally clashed directly in a brutal day-long engagement that left thousands dead on both sides but decided nothing. The Goths withdrew behind their fortified wagon circle, the Romans too exhausted and battered to press the advantage, and the war simply continued month after grinding month without resolution. Valens, occupied for years with his ongoing campaigns against Persia in the east, could not personally address the situation until the year 378, by which point what had begun as a refugee crisis had spiraled into a full-scale war within Rome's own borders. In the spring of that year, Valens finally marched west with the full strength of the Eastern Roman field army, determined to end the Gothic War himself, once and for all. His nephew, the young Western Emperor Gratian, was meanwhile riding east with reinforcements after winning a crushing victory of his own against the Alemanni tribes along the Rhine frontier. It should have been a moment for the two emperors to combine their armies and crush the Gothic rebellion together with overwhelming force. Instead, it became a source of quiet, corrosive rivalry. Valens, older, more experienced, and increasingly resentful of his young nephew's growing reputation, had no intention of sharing credit for ending a war that was, in his mind, entirely his own to finish. By early August, Valens had gathered his army at Adrianople, a fortified city in Thrace, and received reports, later proven wildly inaccurate, that the main Gothic force under Fritigern numbered only around 10,000 fighters. A force the assembled Roman army significantly outnumbered on paper. What Roman scouts failed to account for was a second larger contingent of Gothic and allied cavalry led by the chieftains Elatheus and Saphrax that was currently away from the main camp foraging for food and horses and would return to the battlefield at the single worst possible moment for Rome. Gratian sent word ahead, urging his uncle to wait just a little longer. Rest the exhausted men. Let the reinforcements finish their march and face the Gothic army together with truly overwhelming numbers firmly on Rome's side. It was sound, careful advice from a commander who had just proven himself in battle days earlier, riding hard across hundreds of miles specifically to be there in time. Valens' own council of officers was divided on the matter. Some urged the same patience, most notably a general named Victor, who argued forcefully that waiting cost Rome nothing and that attacking prematurely risked everything the empire could not afford to lose. But Valens, driven by wounded pride, by the sting of his nephew's recent victory, and by faulty intelligence suggesting an easy and total win was already within his grasp, made his decision. He would not wait for Gratian's legions. He would win this war himself that very day. On the morning of the 9th of August, Valens led his army out from the safety of Adrianople toward Fritigern's fortified wagon camp, roughly 8 miles distant across open country. It was, by every surviving ancient account, one of the hottest days of that entire year. The Roman soldiers marched for hours over rough, uneven ground beneath a brutal, relentless sun, with little water available and no real time to rest before finally reaching the enemy's fortified position. Many had left camp before dawn, expecting a short march and a quick engagement. Instead, they found themselves standing for hours in full armor beneath the punishing midday heat, helmets and mail turning into ovens against their own skin, water skins emptied long before any fighting had even begun. Fritigern, meanwhile, played skillfully for time. He sent envoys back and forth proposing peace talks that went nowhere, deliberately dragging out empty negotiations for hours while his men quietly set fire to the dry grass and brushland surrounding their wagon fortress, filling the air with choking smoke that further exhausted the waiting, sweltering Roman ranks, standing motionless in full battle formation beneath the punishing summer sun. Some ancient accounts suggest Fritigern needed this delay for a very specific reason: buying enough time for his absent cavalry to complete their return journey unnoticed. The two armies stood facing one another for hours in that suffocating heat, neither side yet committing fully to open battle. Both sides still half expecting that negotiations might somehow avoid the bloodshed entirely. Then, without any clear order from either high command, a unit of Roman archers and a contingent of skirmishers positioned on the flank suddenly advanced on their own initiative and opened the engagement, triggering a chain reaction that neither Valens nor Fritigern had actually planned for at that exact moment. The battle that would end an emperor's life and shatter an entire army had begun almost by accident. For a brief, promising window, the fighting seemed to favor Rome. The disciplined legions began pushing steadily into the outer Gothic wagon lines, and for a moment it genuinely seemed the day might yet belong to Valens after all. And then, exactly when Fritigern's careful stalling had bought precisely enough time for it to matter most, the missing Gothic and Alan cavalry under Alathius and Saphrax came thundering back from their foraging expedition. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who recorded the battle in devastating first-hand detail, described what happened next as a thunderbolt falling directly upon the Roman lines. The returning horsemen slammed into the exposed left flank and rear of the Roman formation, catching the legions completely unprepared, still fully engaged and dangerously overextended against the Gothic infantry ahead of them. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a collapse. Packed too tightly together to maneuver, blinded by drifting smoke and choking dust, and now under attack from multiple directions simultaneously, the Roman formation disintegrated within minutes. Ammianus wrote that men were crushed together so tightly in the chaos that many could not even raise their own weapons, let alone retreat in any organized fashion. The Roman cavalry that should have shielded the army's exposed flanks had already fled the field entirely, abandoning the infantry to face annihilation alone. By the time the sun began to set that evening, close to two-thirds of the entire Eastern Roman field army lay dead across the plain outside Adrianople, one of the most catastrophic single-day losses in the entire history of Roman warfare. A scale of destruction the empire had not suffered since the days of Hannibal, centuries before. And somewhere within that chaos, the Emperor Valens himself simply disappeared. Ancient accounts differ sharply on the exact details, a fitting irony for a man whose death would become one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The most widely repeated version claims that Valens, wounded by an arrow, was carried by a small group of loyal guards to a nearby farmhouse in search of shelter. Unaware that the Emperor of Rome lay hidden inside, Gothic warriors surrounded the building, unable to force open its barred doors, and simply set the entire structure on fire. Everyone inside burned alive. A single soldier, according to the story, escaped through a narrow window and lived just long enough to tell others what had happened. But by the time a search party finally returned to the smoldering ruin, there was nothing left to identify. A second, less popular ancient tradition claims instead that Valens died simply as one anonymous body among thousands, trampled into the churned earth of the battlefield itself, his imperial armor stripped by looters before anyone realized whose corpse it once belonged to. Either way, the result was the same. Valens's body, the body of a reigning Roman emperor, was never recovered. He had no tomb, no funeral, no grave for future generations to visit or mourn at. He simply vanished from the earth in the middle of the worst military disaster his empire had suffered in over 400 years. The shockwaves reached the imperial capital at Constantinople within days. An emperor was dead, an entire field army was gone, and a victorious, emboldened Gothic force now stood largely unopposed deep inside Roman territory, with nothing but the fortified walls of a handful of scattered cities standing between them and the undefended heartland of the entire Eastern Empire. For the first time in centuries, Rome faced the genuine, terrifying possibility that a foreign army might simply walk through its shattered defenses and never be forced to leave again. In 400 years of imperial history, no reigning Roman emperor had ever died on a battlefield at the hands of a foreign enemy. Emperors had been murdered by their own guards, poisoned by rivals, or executed by usurpers, but never simply cut down and lost amid the smoke of open war. His body left unidentifiable among the dead. Valens' disappearance was not just a military catastrophe. It shattered something psychological at the very heart of Roman identity. The quiet assumption that the empire's leadership, however troubled, was fundamentally untouchable by the armies it claimed to have long since civilized. It fell to a new emperor, Theodosius, raised to power specifically to deal with the catastrophe Valens had left behind him, to somehow salvage what remained of the situation. Unable to destroy the Gothic forces now settled deep inside imperial territory, and lacking anywhere near the manpower needed to even attempt it after Adrianople's staggering losses, Theodosius did something no Roman emperor had ever been forced to do before in the empire's long history. In 382, he signed a treaty allowing the Goths to remain permanently within the borders of the empire as a semi-independent nation under their own chosen leaders, obligated to provide soldiers to Rome when called upon, yet governed largely by their own laws on what was technically Roman soil. No previous Roman emperor had ever formally accepted an entire foreign people as a self-governing nation within imperial borders on these terms. Conquered peoples were absorbed, enslaved, or destroyed, never negotiated with as something close to an equal power sharing the same land. It was presented to the Roman public as a diplomatic triumph, a peace hard won through wisdom rather than the sword. In truth, it was a quiet admission that Rome no longer possessed the strength to remove an enemy it had once casually allowed through its own front door. The precedent set that day did not stay contained within the 4th century. Among the generation of Gothic warriors who grew up as semi-independent subjects of an empire now too weakened to fully control them was a young man named Alaric, a name that, 32 years after the disaster at Adrianople, would become the single most feared word inside the city of Rome itself. But that is a story for another day. Historians still argue over exactly where to mark the true beginning of the end for the Roman Empire in the West. A great many of them start right here in a burning wheat field outside Adrianople on the single afternoon Rome lost an emperor it would never find again. If Rome's darkest military disasters keep pulling you in, subscribe for more untold stories from the ancient world and go find out what happened when Alaric finally finished what began that day at Adrianople, the story of the sack of Rome itself. Comment below. Which death of a Roman emperor do you think changed the course of history the most? Thank you for watching.